Hello and welcome to the Storm of Scripture. Today we're going to be looking at the sealing of the 144,000 in Revelation chapter 7. At the end of Revelation chapter 6, there was the breaking of the sixth seal, and we saw how that is the time of warning of the unrighteous people of the earth. I believe that sixth seal has two effects. One is the warning of the unrighteous, and the second is the sealing of the righteous. The sealing of the righteous in the first part of chapter 7 is an echo of a similar sealing of the righteous that happened in Ezekiel's vision. And we're going to be looking at the background in Ezekiel chapter 9. I'm also going to look at the details of the sealing numbers, the 144,000 represented by 12,000 in each of the 12 tribes of Israel. We're going to look at the breakdown of those 12 tribes and what is significant about the listing here in Revelation 7, different from other places where a similar breakdown is given. Thank you for joining me today as we look at the treasures in Revelation chapter 7, verses 1 through 8. Good morning. We are back in Revelation, this time chapter 7. And as I ended last week, I think chapter 7 is a continuation of the sixth seal events. And all of these seals are anticipating judgment, which will begin with the trumpets. They are not the initiation of the judgment yet. They are preparation. What we see happening in the beginning of chapter 7 is clearly a preparation moment, and that's why I see it as part of a continuation of the sixth seal. So in Revelation chapter 7, verse 1, we read, "After this I saw four angels standing at the four corners of the earth, holding back the four winds of the earth, so that no wind could blow on the earth or on the sea or on any tree." So we have in this vision four angels and four winds. And the question is, who are these four winds? Are they literally wind? Are they some sort of other angelic figure described as four winds? Well, I believe they are angelic figure. In fact, I believe these are the four horsemen that we saw in the first four seals of the scroll when they were broken. So I believe these four winds are the four horsemen who have been deployed to the four corners of the Roman Empire to threaten it with God's wrath. Now I'm going to draw for that conclusion from Zechariah chapter 6. There are 2 points in the book of Zechariah where four horses of different colors show up. In the first one, which is in chapter 1 of Zechariah, there are simply four individual horses and four horsemen on there. In Zechariah chapter 6, we get another set of four horse colors, but the conditions are a little bit different. Let's look at that starting in Zechariah chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. "I looked up again, and I saw, and look, four chariots coming out from between two mountains, and the mountains were mountains of bronze. With the first chariot there were red horses, and with the second chariot there were black horses, and with the third chariot there were white horses, and with the fourth chariot there were strong dappled horses." The Zechariah and the angel that he's with discuss these in verses 4 and 5. "I answered and said to the angel that was talking to me, 'What are these, my Lord?' And the angel answered and said to me, 'These are the four winds of the heavens going out after presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth.'" And so these four charioteers, in this case, because there are now chariots linked to horses, but these four charioteers are described as the four winds, and they are going to the various locations around Israel, north, south, east, and west of Israel, to position themselves there. And so I think this connection with the four winds is a strong one, and that the four winds that are being held back by four angels are the four horsemen. that were described earlier. I think that's the connection. And so they're being told to hold back. And then in verses 2 and 3 in Revelation 7, John sees another angel. Let's read that. I saw another angel ascending from the east, holding the seal of the living God, and he cried out with a loud voice to the 4 angels who were given permission to damage the earth and the sea, saying, do not damage the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the slaves of our God on their foreheads. Now, this angel is ascending from the east. That's another similarity with the horsemen in Zechariah. Although it's not explicit in the text, them coming through the 2 mountains, it describes the 2 mountains of bronze and the horses coming through those mountains. That was a common imagery in the ancient Near East for the sun rising. The sun would come up between mountains in the east. So this other angel ascending from the east and holding the seal of God is sort of another similarity between that and what Zechariah saw. But he is crying out with a loud voice to the 4 angels that were given permission to damage the earth. I think that describes what was given in the first 4 seals. Each of these 4 horsemen were given permission to damage the earth, but not immediately. Here they're told to be restrained. They were already being restrained by the 4 angels who were holding them back, and that needs to continue until they have sealed the slaves of God on their foreheads. Interesting that while the scroll is being unsealed, the slaves of God are being sealed. It's the same word, but the slaves of God are being sealed. What that means exactly isn't stated explicitly in the text. What does it mean to be sealed? At minimum, it means to be recognized and distinguished from the wicked. That the righteous of God will be distinguished from the wicked of God in the upcoming judgment of God. This sealing of God's people is a direct echo of something that happens in the book of Ezekiel. Once again, we see a parallel in the events that unfold in John's vision and the events that unfold in Ezekiel's vision. I think that the connections between Ezekiel's vision and John's vision are quite strong and instructive. So let's look at Ezekiel chapter 9. I'm actually going to read through the entire chapter. It's a short one. But it deals with the sealing of God's people, although it's described not as sealing in that, but as marking. But let's look at that in Ezekiel chapter 9, first couple of verses. He called in my ears with a loud voice. This is Ezekiel describing his vision. So my ears would be Ezekiel's ears, and he would be another angel, angelic figure, or perhaps the voice of God. Both of them speak to Ezekiel throughout his vision, just as we see similarities with John's vision. But going back to the Ezekiel 9, 1 and 2. He called in my ears with a loud voice, saying, they have come near, the punishers of the city. And it just says city in the text, but it's clear from the context. This is Jerusalem that he's referring to as the city. Punishers of the city of Jerusalem, and each with his weapon of destruction in his hand. And look, 6 men coming from the way of the upper gate that faced northward, and each with his weapon for shattering in his hand. And one man was in the midst of them, dressed in linen, and the writing case of the scribe was at his side. And they came and stood beside the bronze altar. There are 6 men going to execute judgment on Jerusalem. I think that could be anticipating the 6 trumpets that will execute judgment on Rome, as I read it, in that as John's vision unfolds. So even the number 6. And of course there are actually 7. There are the 6 men with weapons, and then one with a writing case in his hand. A little bit oddball out. He shows up to a fight with a scroll and a pen. Now let's read a little bit more about this scene, verses 3 and 4. And the glory of the God of Israel lifted itself up from upon the cherub that he was on. This is probably meaning the presence of God in glory above the Ark of the Covenant in the temple. That is where God would rest on the cherubim that are on top of the Ark of the Covenant would be God's glory. And now the glory of God is lifting itself up from upon the cherub that he was on, and went to the threshold of the house, basically to the front door. So he's moving out from the Holy of Holies to the door of the temple. And he called to the man who was clothed in linen with a scribal writing case in his side. And Yahweh said to him, "Go through in the midst of the city, in the midst of Jerusalem, and you must place a mark on the foreheads of the men who are groaning and lamenting about all of the detestable things that are being done in the midst of her." So the mark is going on the righteous who are grieving the idolatry and the wickedness in the city. So the sign that they are God's faithful is that they are grieving the wickedness. In John's description is the slaves of God, those who are serving him and of his household. So the similar group in Ezekiel, it is those who are groaning. And they are getting a mark on their foreheads. In Hebrew, the word for mark is tav. It's a word. It's also a letter. The letter tav, the name of a letter, is a word for a mark. In the oldest Hebrew script, not the pictograph version, but when it started to become letters, the tav was written as an X. So it's interesting, the connections. And some Christians early on, like early church fathers, saw this mark on their foreheads, the tav, as a cross. It's also a letter chi. The X of the Hebrew, Paleo-Hebrew alphabet would have looked like a chi in Greek, which is, of course, the first letter of Christ. So the mark on the foreheads, even from Ezekiel, is suggestive of a mark of Christ on these people. And Christians saw that early on and made hay out of it. I don't know how much Ezekiel had that in mind per se, but it certainly is resonant. And when we see a mark being put on in the book of Revelation, we could see a similar mark, the mark of Christ being put on the faithful slaves of God. Well, the instruction continues in Ezekiel 9, 5, and 6. To the others he said in my hearing, "Go through the city behind him and kill. Your eyes shall not take pity, you shall not have compassion. You must kill totally old man, and young woman, and little children and women. But concerning every man with a mark on him, you must not approach. And from my sanctuary you must begin." And they began with the old men who were before the house. So the other 6 are behind the mark. That means the person or the angel marking the faithful goes ahead. That happens first before the wrath is distributed by the other 6. I think this is a strong echo of the mark of Passover. In this, on individuals rather than on households, but is, yes, a mark where the wrath of God will pass over those with the mark. I think it's very symbolically connected. Who actually did the killing? Did the people in Jerusalem just fall over? No. The Babylonians, they're the ones who actually do the killing. The Babylonians invade. Ezekiel is writing this from exile because the Babylonians have already overcome Jerusalem. They're already in charge of the area, but they haven't destroyed Jerusalem yet. Ezekiel is one of the first exiles to be taken into captivity with the early event. So Jerusalem is still standing. The temple is still intact. There are exiles like Daniel out of Jerusalem that were taken in an earlier raid, but the city has still stood. This is a picture and anticipating the fact that Nebuchadnezzar will come back to Jerusalem, and the next time he's wiping it out and killing, then destroying the city. This is a promise that those people will die, but there will be a distinction. Interestingly, the rabbinical thinking later on is not that this mark saved the people from death, but that the mark killed them peacefully, so that they did not die in battle or tortured, but they died peacefully because God gave them a mark that said that they were saved. And this is just coming from the fact that it's historically a fact that righteous and unrighteous all died in Jerusalem. Everyone did. If they weren't taken into exile, they died. And so this is a historical engagement with that, to say that the mark is not meaningless. Mark was meaningful, but it didn't save them from death. It marked them as righteous. Large swaths of the city died when Nebuchadnezzar took it. But how any individual person died, we cannot say. But the Jewish rabbis of later days thought of this passage and saw that God was marking his people, saving them from the horror of death by marking them this way. To continue and finish up the chapter, Ezekiel 9, 7 and 8, he said to them, defile the house, and the house would have been the temple. The word the house in this passage probably means the temple of God, the house of God. Defile the house, fill the courtyards with the dead, go out. And they went out, and they killed in the city. And then as they were striking, and I was left behind, I fell on my face, and I cried out, and I said, Ah, Lord Yahweh, will you be destroying all of the remnant of Israel while you pour out your rage on Jerusalem? Let's finish his answer, verses 9 and 10. He said to me, the guilt of the house of Israel and Judah is exceedingly great, and the land is filled with blood guilt, and the city is full of injustice. For they say Yahweh abandoned the land, and Yahweh does not see, and my eye will not take pity, and I will not have compassion. Their way I will bring on their head. So basically they're getting what they have given. They have not shown compassion. They have not shown pity on the poor or the powerless. And so God is not going to show pity on them. The very last verse comes back around to the man with the writing case, Ezekiel 9:11. Look, the man clothed in linen and with a writing case at his side was bringing back a word, saying, I have done all that you commanded me. The mark. Clearly a mark in Jerusalem to distinguish the righteous from the wicked. Did it save them from death? That was a debatable thing. It seems to suggest that in Ezekiel 9, but history would tell us more than likely it did not save them from death, which is why the Jewish rabbis saw that it was something else, that they died mercifully rather than painfully at this moment. But we have, nevertheless, a parallel with an angel coming in John's vision to mark the slaves of God when the wrath is coming. In Revelation 7:4, then, we hear the number of the ones who were sealed. 144,000 sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. Although it's not mentioned in Ezekiel, essentially the only tribe would have been represented in Jerusalem would have been Judah. Possibly Benjamin, maybe a remnant, a handful of others, but the marked people in Jerusalem would have been mostly just from Judah. But the mark coming on all of the slaves of God are from every tribe of the sons of Israel. Verses 5 through 8 just gives us the rundown. I'll go ahead and read it. From the tribe of Judah, 12,000 sealed. From the tribe of Reuben, 12,000. From the tribe of Gad, 12,000. From the tribe of Asher, 12,000. From the tribe of Naphtali, 12,000. From the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000. From the tribe of Simeon, 12,000. From the tribe of Levi, 12,000. From the tribe of Issachar, 12,000. From the tribe of Zebulun, 12,000. From the tribe of Joseph, 12,000. From the tribe of Benjamin, 12,000 were sealed. So 12 tribes. I'm going to talk a little bit about how this list of tribes differs from an expected list, because there are a couple of important omissions and a couple of important inclusions that are different than most renditions of the 12 tribes of Israel. This list, a little different in nature from the Ezekiel context, because in Ezekiel, it's just the people in Jerusalem. There's no distinction of tribe. But this list sounds very much like the kind of counting of tribes that happens during the Exodus event, not in Exodus proper, but in the book of Numbers. I mean, why is the book of Numbers called the book of Numbers? Because they count people often in the book. It starts with a census. And so Numbers chapter 1, verses 1 through 3 sets it up this way. Yahweh spoke to Moses in the desert of Sinai in the tent of assembly on the first of the month, and in the second year after they came out of the land of Egypt, saying, Take a census of the entire community of the Israelites, according to their clans and their families, according to the number of names, every male individually from 20 years old and above, everyone in Israel who is able to go to war, and you and Aaron must muster them for their wars. This is a warrior census. They counted them so they knew how many soldiers they would have that they could put to field as they were fighting their way through the nations around them and eventually into the promised land. So this counting of the 144,000 is like God's army. Who are going to stand for God? Obviously, there are opponents. There are Rome and all of the persecutions that have been giving down. Now God is going to muster his army. And so he marks them and counts them. Now, here's an actual accounting from Numbers chapter 1, verses 20 through 43. Now, it's highly abbreviated so that it is clearly more parallel with what we see in Revelation. But I think that the bones of the story, the core elements, are very parallel. In Numbers 1, 20 through 43, the count goes like this. From the tribe of Reuben were 46,500. From the tribe of Simeon were 59,300. From the tribe of Gad were 45,650. From the tribe of Judah were 74,600. From the tribe of Issachar were 54,400. From the tribe of Zebulun were 57,400. From the descendants of Joseph, from the tribe of Ephraim were 40,500. From the tribe of Manasseh were 32,200. From the tribe of Benjamin were 35,400. And from the tribe of Dan were 62,700. And from the tribe of Asher were 41,500. From the tribe of Naphtali were 53,400. Notice how much fewer we're talking about in Revelation than were in the Exodus. A lot fewer. Which is one of the prophecies that only a remnant of Israel would emerge and ultimately be saved. That the majority of Israel would be lost and a remnant would be saved. But another key element of that is that all of Israel would be found in that remnant. And we're going to talk about that next week some more. So I'm not going to get into the all of Israel idea today, but it's definitely part of why all 12 tribes are represented. And we're going to talk about that next week. What I do want to touch on before we close today are the unique distinctives of this list of tribes versus most of the list of tribes. The two omitted of the 12 brothers or tribes would be Ephraim and Dan. Now, I think Ephraim is omitted because he's included with Joseph, who is on the list. And even in that list we saw from Numbers, it says from the descendants of Joseph, and then it gives Ephraim and Manasseh as follow-ups. Now, Manasseh makes the list in the Revelation, but Ephraim, I think, is just being included with Joseph. However, Dan is omitted. And I think that's important because Dan is early on connected with wickedness, as if the entire tribe has sort of been given over to a wicked fate. I won't read it in interest of time, but in Judges chapter 18, verses 27 through 31, the Danites take a random guy named Micah. Micah had set up a kind of shrine in his house. All of Judges 18 is about this shrine that this man named Micah had set up for himself. He had installed his own son as a priest who was not a Levite and was not just worshiping Yahweh, but actually had teraphim, which were household pagan gods. And he was using both, kind of mixing together pagan worship rituals and Yahweh worship rituals and doing them both in his house. And the Danites come through on their way to settle their territory in the far north of the territory of Israel. And when they see this man with his shrine, they take his shrine, all the elements of his shrine with them. And then they use bullying tactics to silence the guy when he complains about them taking all of his stuff. They just threaten him and then move on. And so the Danites established their territory in the far north of Israel under all of these bad circumstances. Pagan worship practices mixed with Yahweh worship practices, threatening and belligerence, and all of this stuff. And when they get to the place where they're going to settle, it's called out here in this passage that it is a peaceful city that the Danites just massacre. So Danite tribe is associated with this kind of wickedness from the very inception of their time in the book of Judges. So that may be why Dan is omitted. Some interpreters actually say the omission of Dan, coupled with the history of wickedness, suggests that the Antichrist himself comes from the tribe of Dan. They would make connections there with their Revelation interpretation. I think that's reading a little too much into the text, but I do think it explains why Dan is one of the two tribes that gets set apart. Now, partly it's a practical reason to omit them so that two other brothers could be added that normally aren't. Levi is normally not part of the 12 tribes. Why? Because they were census for war, and the Levites didn't have warriors. They were all priests. The whole Levite tribe. Now, they were sometimes involved in the battles. They would, for example, during the time of the Judges, they would have the Ark of the Covenant sometimes with them. In the time of Joshua and the Judges, the Ark of the Covenant was sometimes there. The priest would have the Ark, so the priest would be involved. But they weren't counted as soldiers, as frontline soldiers. And so they weren't part of these military censuses. And they didn't have territory because they were scattered throughout all the other 12 tribes. Because Manasseh and Ephraim, the two sons of Joseph, they each got to be their own separate tribe. And so the Levites were scattered amongst the other 12. They didn't have a territory of their own. So the Levites weren't there, but they were special. They were set apart because they were priests for God. I think the reason they're included in this list is because they are no longer special. They're one of the 12 tribes. All of the people of God, all of the slaves of God, are priests and kings. That's been established in the book of Revelation already, that when Christ died, he made us priests and kings. So Levi has no more special role to play. They are all a part of God's family, God's slaves, like equals to the other tribes that are represented. So that's why I think Levi's included in this countdown. It's just one more tribe like all the rest. Joseph, I think, is specifically included because Joseph was actually connected to the messianic profile. We are familiar with the son of David as a reference to Messiah, but actually son of Joseph was actually a designation for a Messiah as well. These two were seen in the Jewish mind as two separate Messiahs. They would either come concurrently or maybe one after another, but the son of David and the son of Joseph were perceived as Messiah figures separate. In Jesus, we've seen that they are one. that Jesus is both the son of Joseph, quite literally, as well as metaphorically, the son of Joseph and the son of David. And just to review some of the connections with Joseph in the Messianic profile, this is basically a list that we used when we were looking at Joseph through our walk through Genesis and the figures in Genesis. But he was a specially beloved son. He was righteous. At no point does Joseph do something wicked in the story of Joseph. He was filled with the Holy Spirit, which is how he got elevated in Pharaoh's court, because in Genesis 41:38, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? He was exalted as a ruler, of course, by Pharaoh, and he brought salvation. He brought salvation not just for the Israelites, but for the Egyptians as well. He saved Jew and Gentile in his own way in his day. And so he was a messianic figure of his own right. And I think that's why Joseph is listed in the list alongside Judah, the tribe of David, and the tribe of Joseph. So those are some of the distinctives of the list of the 12 tribes and the 144,000. Next week, we will look at the next section where John sees something different than he hears, another pattern in the book of Revelation. Thank you for joining me today as we continue our study in the book of Revelation. I welcome your comment either here on the YouTube video or in the related Facebook group, the Storm of Scripture discussion group. I look forward to the next time we meet to study again the treasures in the biblical text.